Folks, this week's story is a wild one, connected to one that we've already told a few years back. Well, today we're diving deeper into the life of a fellow by the name of Gus McCoig, known by some as Little Dillinger. Another one of the stories of Appalachia.
Steve, I think these stories, especially about Appalachia, and also, I guess, the comparison, sort of, if you want to call it that, of big-time crime and Appalachia, a lot of people might think you're just trying to blow smoke and, you know, get everybody's hopes up in something like this. But this is real. This was a real thing that happened. And then I also start thinking about when I hear the name Little Dillinger, it just makes me want to break out and do a Edward G. Robinson, impersonation almost to a degree. I can hear him saying something like, I'm Little Dillinger, but I'm not going to do the impersonation of him per se. So.
Well, all this happened right about the time that we had John Dillinger and Bonnie and Clyde and Pretty Boy Floyd and all those folks. These are Appalachian homegrown outlaws. And we've told you several of those stories. And one of those that we spoke about in the past is connected to this particular story. And what brought us to be doing this is that one of this guy's relatives contacted us. Seems he's a listener to the podcast.
Well,
and contacted us and said, you need to look more into this, which I hadn't done at the time. It turns out that Gus McCoig, who was in league, and I'll go ahead and say it, with the Bunch gang, had a whole other story after that one ended that I hadn't really been aware of. And it's a doozy too.
Well, this is the reason why we enjoy having our listeners interact with us and tell us this sort of thing, because, again, we'll say this as we have said it several times before. We're not historians. We're not history experts or anything like that. We're just two guys that have a love for history, and we're pulling this information up, and we're getting it from what is considered at least official sources at the time, but sometimes we don't get the family connection or other things that are thrown in there as well. And so thanks to them for that. This is going to be wild. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, and it also helps us preserve some of the history of Appalachia, which is really why we do this podcast to start with. But, if you've been with us, folks, for a while, you might remember our episode on Clarence Bunch and his gang. That Bunch's partner in crime was the fellow we're going to talk about today, Gus McCoig, who, it turns out, had a story after his time with the Bunch gang that was every bit as interesting and worth telling. McCoig's story has jailbreaks, bank robberies, shootouts, and maybe a little too much confidence for his own good. And folks, this is the story of Gus McCoig, born in Jefferson County, Tennessee on December 20th, 1911.
Now, when we say that this guy had a knack for trouble, we mean it. He came into the public eye in the early 1930s, involved in a lot of petty crime in East Tennessee. It all really starts to pick up steam in the spring of 1934. That's when Gus McCoig is sitting in the Cocke County Jail on forgery charges. Nothing flashy just yet. But then along comes Clarence Bunch. Bunch had just been arrested during a moonshine raid in Knoxville at a house where he was likely picking up a load of whiskey. Authorities nabbed him not on being at the house, but on a warrant out of Virginia. Bank robbery in Lee County, or the town of Ewing. Bunch gets hauled to the same jail Gus is in, and, well, these two, they just hit it right off, right away. Like birds of a feather, as they say, or more like the meeting of minds, if you want to call it that, if your minds are scheming up a jailbreak. And that's exactly what they did. McCoig and Bunch came up with a plan, and it works. They bust out of that jail and form what would be known as the Bunch Gang.
And, Rod, they spent the spring and summer of 1934 raising all kinds of hell all across East Tennessee. Highway robbery, theft, assaults, just general outlaw behavior. These guys were the Appalachian version of Bonnie and Clyde or John Dillinger. And it didn't last long. That same summer, Clarence Bunch was killed by law enforcement, and that was the end of the Bunch gang. But Gus, well, he had a bit more outlaw left in him. He was caught and arrested, then tried and convicted on 2 counts of highway robbery for his part in the gang's East Tennessee crime spree. And on November 22nd, 1934, he was sentenced to 30 years in the Tennessee State Penitentiary. And, as you probably already guessed, Gus McCoig did not intend to serve all that time. Thus begins today's story. Right, Rod?
Yes, because in December of 1935, just a year after that sentence, 24-year-old Gus McCoig teamed up with another prisoner, 19-year-old Pete Dean. The two of them pulled off a very bold escape from the penitentiary. They carved themselves a fake gun out of a piece of wood, and with that wooden gun, they managed to convince a deputy warden to be their personal chauffeur and drive them right out of the front gates of the Tennessee State Prison. Not a Hollywood movie here, folks, just this is what really happened. They let the warden go a few miles down the road and took his car, making their way up the East Tennessee mountains. And what do they find there? Well, they meet up with another fugitive, Frank Hobson, who had escaped from a prison farm and was also on the run from the law.
Now you got a trio of outlaws, and it does not take long for them to pick up where the Bunch gang left off. They're quickly labeled by the press as the Little Dillinger Gang, with Gus McCoig as the head gangster. And they hit the news just a few days after McCoig and Dean's escape on December 6, 1935. The trio rolled into New Tazewell, Tennessee, and robbed the Citizens Bank. They walked in with guns, lined up the customers and the employees against the wall, and they walked out with $2,000. That's about, get this, Rod, 45 grand in today's money.
Wow.
But this story is not just about a bank robbery, because things soon start to get very bloody. As they left, a local cobbler, William Engel, grabbed a pistol and ran out into the street. He fired at the gang's getaway car, hitting it. McCoig leaned out and returned fire, and thankfully, nobody got hit. Well, not yet anyway.
Well, that shootout, Steve, in New Tazewell did more than just make a little bit of noise. It alerted lawmen across the region that a new gang was in town. Union County Sheriff L.B. Hutchinson and his deputy, Austin Matthews, are among the first to respond. So they head out toward New Tazewell, driving down Highway 33, about 7 miles from Maynardsville near the Clinch River Bridge. They pull over and wait, and sure enough, the robbers come speeding down the road. The sheriff pulls out to follow. But here's where it turns tragic. The robbers slammed on their brakes, turned their Ford sideways, and blocked the bridge. Hutchinson and Matthews stop their car a few yards away and get out. Hutchinson steps forward, maybe thinking he can talk them down.
But Rod, Gus McCoig was not in the mood to talk. He raised his .45 and fired. The shot hit the sheriff's windshield. McCoig took careful aim and fired again at the sheriff, who continued to approach. That shot hit Sheriff Hutchinson squarely between the eyes, killing him instantly. And then he turned the gun on Deputy Matthews and ordered him to surrender. Just so happens, at that very moment, a Greyhound bus loaded with passengers rolled up behind them, stuck because the bridge was blocked. McCoig simply walked over to it like he owned the road, showed off his pistol, and bragged to the passengers that, yep, he'd just killed the sheriff.
Wow, that's being quite boastful, Steve.
Mm-hmm.
And after his little boast, McCoig, Hobson, and Dean took off with their loot, vanishing into the mountains. They holed up in a remote cabin, probably thinking they were safe. But a posse soon formed, made up of local men, including squirrel hunters out of the woods, who joined the chase. And wouldn't you know it, that little mountain cabin turned into a battleground. The gang managed to shoot their way out and escape again, but not for long.
The shooting of Sheriff Hutchinson stunned East Tennessee. Now, it wasn't just another outlaw story. A sheriff was dead, killed in broad daylight, and the killers were still on the loose. And the manhunt was on. And believe it or not, soon after the shooting, there was a twist. One of the gang members, Frank Hobson, gave up. He walked out and surrendered, claiming he'd been abandoned by McCoig and Pete Dean not long after the killing. Soon enough, the governor of Tennessee, Hill McAllister, put out a reward for the capture of McCoig and Dean, and Union County added another $1,000, and the Citizens Bank of Tazewell tossed in $250 of their own.
Well, the word was out. Bring these two in, and you know what the moniker is, dead or alive. And with that kind of money on the table, tips came flooding in, some for real, most of them not. For example, not long after Hobson gave himself up, authorities picked up 3 other men in St. Charles, Virginia. One of them had broken out of Brushy Mountain State Prison. Well, these 3 offered a deal to the police, said they would give up McCoig and Dean's location if they could get a piece of that reward money in a plea deal. Well, the authorities didn't bite, and it turns out those 3 didn't know a thing, just looking for a shortcut out of their own trouble.
Well, still, the rumors didn't stop there. Sightings of the two started popping up all over East Tennessee and Southwest Virginia. One of those sightings came in December in Washington County, Tennessee. Sheriff's deputies, officers from Knox County, and even federal agents from the FBI all converged on a house on Blackley Creek. Now, they'd gotten word that the fugitives were holed up there, but when they busted the door down, they found out it wasn't McCoig and Dean. It was 2 out-of-towners, one from Idaho, one from Nebraska, just visiting. No connection at all. Just wrong place, wrong time, I guess.
Wow. There were other reports too, Steve. 2 gas stations in Greenville got robbed almost at the same time, and folks there thought, that's got to be them. Then there was a report from Gatlinburg where 2 nervous men pulled into a gas station, asked real fast about how to get to Newport, then they took off. Were they Dean and McCoig? Well, could have been, but they might not have been. Who knows? By late December, folks were on edge. Then came something a bit, well, bold. On December 30th, lawmen in White Pine, Tennessee got a message, a threat that claimed to be from McCoig and Dean, and it said they were going to get you and a couple of the councilmen and rob the bank there. White Pine lit up like a powder keg. Marshal C.I. Ballard didn't take any chances. He deputized a bunch of citizens, armed them heavy, and for a while, White Pine looked more like a war zone than a town.
And, Rod, the very next night, New Year's Eve, guess who showed up?
Well, yes.
Yeah,
we know.
Mr. McCoig and Mr. Dean, just like the note said. Now, they were spotted again on January 13th, 1936. And then, just like that, they vanished. No sightings, no news, until February 7th, when Pete Dean got caught, arrested for a robbery in Whitleyville, Tennessee, close to the Kentucky state line. Get this, Rod. Turns out he'd been using the alias Tom Woods, and under that name, he had just married a local high school girl, Trula Hines from Rockwood. Now, she later told reporters why she didn't have any idea that her brand new husband was really a wanted outlaw.
Well, with Dean behind bars, the heat now fell on McCoig, and it turned red hot again. Just one night after Dean's arrest, a man named Thomas Dukes, who ran a tourist camp in Crossville, called up the Cumberland County Sheriff. He said Gus McCoig was holed up in one of their cabins. Well, Sheriff Walter Hill wasted no time. He and several of his deputies rushed to the tourist camp, with Dukes and his wife coming along to point out the cabin. And as the law got close, they heard music from inside. It was McCoig, strumming a guitar and singing. Well, the sheriff signaled one of his men to poke a rifle through the window. At the same time, Hill kicked in the door, and just like that, the whole situation was over.
That's right, Rod. No gunfire, no standoff. Gus McCoig simply looked up and surrendered quietly with the guitar in his lap. After his arrest, McCoig was brought back to Union County. And on the way, a reporter from the Nashville Tennessean newspaper got a rare chance to interview him. McCoig was calm, even smoking a cigar. He said he wanted a photo taken to send to his mother. He also told the paper he'd been with Pete Dean during the holdup that got Dean caught, said he was drunk during the killing of Sheriff Hutchinson, and didn't remember what happened. Of course, he also claimed he didn't pull the trigger. Mm-hmm. He said he and Dean had split up about a month before his own arrest, and that he'd been wandering all over Nashville, Knoxville, even as far as North Carolina and Ohio.
But McCoig wasn't doing well, mentally, that is. The day before the interview, he'd tried to end his life by swallowing 24 aspirin tablets. Boy, you know what that would do to Steve. 24 aspirin tablets? It'd be a very painful death, let's just put it that way. He left a suicide note that read, quote, "I'm doing this because I'd rather die than go back to the penitentiary," end quote. Now, doctors saved him, and he was sent back to his cell. On February 23, 1936, McCoig, Dean, and Frank Hobson were all brought to court in Union County to stand trial for the murder of Sheriff L.B. Hutchinson. 600 people were called for jury duty. Finding an impartial jury in a small community where everybody knew the sheriff and the story was no easy task, but eventually a jury was seated and the trial got underway.
And as you can imagine, all three men pleaded not guilty. Dean and Hobson added insanity defenses, and Hobson topped that as well by claiming that he'd been coerced into doing these crimes. Well, the courtroom itself was packed, as you can imagine. Testimony came from the slain sheriff's brother, J.W. Hutchinson, and his widow, Della Hutchinson, who, Rod, by the way, had been appointed sheriff after her husband's death, making her the third such woman in Tennessee history to hold that title. Other witnesses included Deputy Austin Matthews, the Greyhound bus driver who got caught up in the chaos, and the president of the Citizens Bank of Tazewell, along with psychologists, friends of the accused, and multiple law officers. That trial lasted 6 full days.
And ironically, on February 29, 1936, Leap Day, the jury handed down its verdict: guilty. All three men found guilty of first-degree murder. Then the jury handed down the sentence: death for all three, and death by electrocution. This, though, wasn't the end of the story. All three men filed appeals, and all three appeals were unsuccessful. A year later, though, on March 9, 1937, Tennessee had a new governor, Gordon Browning. He stepped in and commuted the sentences of Dean and Hobson to life in prison based upon reports of extenuating circumstances in their case.
But, Rod, what about Gus McCoig? Well, no such luck for him. His execution was scheduled for April 8, 1937, and the governor let it stand. McCoig was just 25 years old. Now, he reportedly went to his death bravely, but bitter that his two partners were spared while he alone would die. The widow and children of Sheriff Hutchinson came to the prison that morning where they asked to witness the execution, but they were turned away. They were, however, allowed to visit McCoig on death row and view his body afterwards. And at 5:22 a.m., April 8, 1937, Gus McCoig was electrocuted at the Tennessee State Prison in Nashville.
He was buried soon after that in Jefferson County at the Chestnut Hill Methodist Church Cemetery. Now, a crowd gathered, curious to see the final chapter of the man who'd once captured the attention and, yes, fear of a whole region.
Now, here's a little thing about that crowd.
Okay.
They had a huge crowd there to watch it, but when it came time to lower his body into the ground, not a soul would do it. They just all turned around and left.
Wow.
Yeah, so a terrible end to this. And there's one other detail I do want to share that I didn't put directly in the story, and this came from Gus's relative, and that was that there was a cave on his family's property, our listener's property, and during the time he was on the run, and Gus never said this, and it wasn't in the newspaper reports, but he spent some time in that cave hiding out from time to time. So a little bit of detail I thought I'd add in there.
Just, I mean, interesting all-around story about this. I mean, we knew some of this, but we didn't know really the whole story about all of this and the way it all came down to a certain degree. And, you know, I really didn't know that much about, I mean, we talked about Hobson, we talked about him, and we talked about the other gentleman there, Dean, I believe. But, you know, this on Gus McCoig was a little bit more in detail, a little bit more information that I guess that we just didn't have at the time. But thankfully, to a listener, a loyal listener, we found out a little bit more about the history and about the life of this man, Gus McCoig, and, you know, all about what the little Dillinger gang was all about.
Yeah, well, this fellow was, he was instrumental in a lot of stuff, you know. He was basically the core of the Bunch gang, because he and Mr. Bunch were in jail and broke out at the same time. And as I said, I thought when that was done, it was done, and then find out, no, this guy broke out of jail and did it all over again, only he supercharged what Clarence Bunch did, to be honest.
Wow. This was another one of those stories, too, that shows, especially back in rural Appalachia in those days, that if word got out, everybody, to a certain degree, it traveled the grapevine very quickly, whether you had a telephone or not. It got through, and everybody knew somewhere, some way, somehow that, hey, we better be on the lookout for something like this. And you've got to give kudos to the law enforcement officials there right before New Year's of that happening and being ready for it. But then, you know, having to wait till later in order to, you know, finally bring this man to justice.
And folks, that's the story of outlaw Gus McCoig, another one of the stories of Appalachia. Thanks for listening. Be sure to subscribe to the Stories podcast if you haven't done so already. You'll find us on Spreaker, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or on your favorite podcast app. We're also on YouTube, if you think you can handle looking at us, that is. And if you're on YouTube, we'd appreciate it if you'd share our stories with all your friends, and let's get a whole bunch of people watching these stories, okay? Till next we meet, y'all take care. So long, everybody.
So long.